Всем привет! Меня зовут Артемий Левкой, и это «Синяя лампа». Подкаст, в котором мы обсуждаем культуру и политику с ярчайшими представителями русскоязычной миграции. Наша сегодняшняя гостья — Ekaterina Schulmann. Тема выпуска — «Как изучать закрывающуюся страну. Политология в эпоху официальной секретности, искажения данных и пропаганды». Беседовать с ней будет Михаил Рохлиц, профессор Оксфордского университета и специалист по российской политике и экономике. Эта встреча прошла в Оксфорде 21 июня 2025 года. Приятного просмотра.
We are truly honored to be joined by two of the most experienced and thoughtful analysts of Russian politics tonight, and please join me in welcoming them both.
I'm extremely pleased that we have Ekaterina here. I also wanted to say a big thanks to the Oxford New Russian Society, which made all this possible, which did all the organization, to Artyom and the team. Yeah, so Ekaterina is one of the most well-known Russian political scientists. And I first met Ekaterina in 2015, I think, in Los Angeles, when we were writing a book, a group of Russian political scientists, and also from Europe and the United States, we tried to understand Russia, how Russia is working. The book had the title at the time, The New Autocracy. It was an edited volume by Daniel Treisman. And this was a very different time, in 2015, 2016. And the book came out in 2018. And since then, Russia has changed a lot. Russia has become a very different type of autocracy, much harsher autocracy. And in particular, since 2022, it has become much more difficult for us as social scientists to study this context of Russia. Many of us, probably most of us who study the country, can't go to Russia anymore. We can't do interviews in Russia in person. It's much more difficult to get data from Russia, and the data that we can get is probably of much lower quality. It's much more difficult to do surveys. We don't know if people really respond to these surveys in ways they did before, if they kind of change or are cautious in really saying what they think. And all of these topics, we have to keep it in mind and make it much more difficult for us to understand how Russia is working today. But still, we have to understand this country more than ever. And this is why I'm so glad that Ekaterina is here tonight, because she's going to speak about these difficulties that we are facing and what kind of solutions we can apply to them. Thank you.
Thank you. So the subject we are going to talk about today is how to study a closing country. The situation that we Russia watchers and Russia experts and political scientists studying the region found ourselves in is indeed complicated. We are all the time asked the question, how can you even know what is happening in Russia if you have last been there 3 years ago? That's a very popular kind of question that you get. But even putting aside the mysticism that supposes that in order to understand your subject, you have to be physically present there, which of course makes havoc of ancient world studies, for example, still, we do face some grave difficulties. Not only, as Michael has noticed, we are no longer able to go to the country. We are unable to conduct any sort of scholarly work there, even in absentia. We are less and less able to engage agents on the ground in whatever capacity, because it's dangerous for them to communicate with any sort of foreign entities, to say nothing of so-called undesirable organizations, to communicate with whom is a criminal offense, or foreign agents which spread, plague at a touch. If you are in conversation or in any sort of public communication with a foreign agent, then you have a fair chance of becoming one yourself some next fine Friday. But this is just part of our difficulties. The problem of growing and spreading official secrecy has not started in 2022. Even before that, the scanty fruits of short-lived Medvedev's modernization have been dying out. Let me remind you, those of you that have already forgotten, and that is a very much forgotten era, that during the 4 years of Medvedev's presidency, the official slogan was innovation, modernization, transparency, and something else. You see, even I can't remember all the 4 I's that were that constituted this official slogan, but this period coincided with the growth and flowering of the Russian internet technologies. So Russian web, the Runet, was then already highly developed technologically and yet more or less free from official constraints and governmental oversight. So those were the days indeed. In that period, 2008-2011, it became obligatory for state services, for the ministries and federal agencies to publish a lot of information online. They became more transparent. It was at that period when, for example, state servants above a certain level were obliged to publish their tax declarations. It's a thing that now is weird even to remember, but then it was a reality. Starting 2012, the conservative turn that Russian politics have taken with the return of the president to his accustomed place have also influenced this degree of official transparency. So this is to say that our troubles have not started with 2022, but of course, since the beginning of the war, situations have been deteriorating quickly. Just a few facts to assess the amount of the damage. Over the past 3 years, approximately 900 official data sets have been removed from official Russian resources. Again, this is not some information by NGOs or by independent journalism, investigators, or the like. These are the data sets that were made available by Russian state bodies, ministries, agencies, services, and the like. Since the start of the war, month after month, more and more information that used to be available became secret. For example, starting October 2022, energy consumption and production indicators have been taken off online. Detailed import-export data is no longer available. Electricity production and consumption has also been made unavailable by the Ministry of Energy. One wonders why. One wonders why. Why? Because consumption of electricity is one of the simplest markers out there of the increase or decrease of industrial production. Specifically, aluminium is basically solid electricity. So if you have an increase in production, for example, in your military industrial complex, your electricity consumption rates will be increasing as well. Or if you are faking it, they will not be increasing that much. I suspect that for the very same reason, the Russian railroads have stopped publishing the amount of whatever they are transporting, because this would also show both the volume and the direction in which the goods and materials are going. Then, the above-mentioned financial disclosures and income declaration of state officials unavailable for reasons of security, of course, so that the enemy doesn't get to know what their families are and what do they own. And last but not least, which perhaps is the saddest sign for me, all kinds of demographic data becomes less and less available. First, mortality data became classified. Causes of mortality and regional mortality. Why? Of course, to prevent the world and the country itself from seeing the military losses, the extent and the distribution of military losses. Then also birth rates became unavailable. Why? In order not to scare the population with the amount of success of the state demographic policies, of course. As we speak, even as we speak, Rosstat is taking down its basic online database. Those who know, know. I will not trouble your ears with the complicated Russian abbreviation. But again, this is one of the basic sources of an actual knowledge about the country. They say that it's for technical reasons, site under construction, etc. But there are grave fears that the information will not come back. It will not become available. Upon, for example, attempting, as some of my colleagues are trying to do, to download information, it appears that a lot of it is non-downloadable. I remember how even before the war, the Central Electoral Commission has introduced such technical amendments to its site and the connected database as made it impossible to download the, again, publicly available information on the way people vote. It ought to be public. They couldn't close it down, but they made actual parsing difficult. I remember it was yet the time when we could go to the Central Electoral Commission and its top management were talking with us, and Grigory Milkanyans, who now got 10 years of penal colony, was then invited. He went there like to his job. Now he was there every week, and he was an expert who was listened to. And so we went in a group to protest against this impossibility of parsing the data from the website. And what they told us was, they told us two things. As usual in autocracies, they have numerous explanations that contradict each other. First, we are constructing a new site which will be much better than the previous one. This is why. And second, hostile DDoS attacks. And this could interfere with the voting process for whatever reason. We can't allow the enemies to access what? How you elect the Tomsk city council. So what would the enemy do with it? So we had those self-contradicting explanations, but the tendency was evident even back then. To understand the amount of the damage, let me tell you that in a demographic community and generally among social scientists, there's a very lively discussion currently on the question, how many people live in Russia? And this is not about the so-called new territories, the imaginary subjects of the Russian Federation. It's about the so-called canonical territory. Many specialists consider that the figure that we have been accustomed to hear every day of our life since I was a schoolgirl, 142 million people, familiar, right? That it is something of a symbolic figure rather. Regional authorities have an incentive, a very real incentive, in increasing the number of people who live in their territories. And the reason is, again, self-evident to everyone who studied Russia. It's called подушевое финансирование, per capita financing. For a long time, no one was taking seriously any statistics coming from the Northern Caucasian republics. People live forever there. Maternity capital is expanded on fantastic number of children. Figures like income per capita or levels of unemployment are also something that the folklorists should study rather than demographers and economists. And that was very much before the war. So there is the discussion, and some experts say that the actual figure of Russian population may be closer to 131 million people, and some put it down as low as 110. And this is exasperating because it gives you an impression that we're discussing a Syrian empire, rather than the country that is currently still there in an age where you can see a fly cross a street by using Google Maps. And you can't really answer the question, what is the amount of the Russian population? And this brings me to the second problem. So we have downright closing down of information and official secrecy. For example, the federal budget. The federal budget is being discussed in the Duma during open plenary sessions, but there is the so-called secret clauses of the budget, and these are discussed by a special secret commission that consists mostly of State Duma deputies and Federation Council members with a history in secret services or the military. The percentage of articles that belong to this secret category has steadily been increasing during the last 25 years. Now it's around 30%. So 30% of all federal budget spending is classified. We can't know what that is. But besides this, I would say, honest part of the problem, the straightforward part of the problem, just making information unavailable, we have the second problem, on which I have touched in discussing the Russian population, the distortion of information. If we get back to the demographic data, it is generally supposed, it is generally considered that the general census of 2021 was a flop. Experts don't use data of the 2021 census seriously. Why? It was a census that was conducted during the pandemic period. And it was done on a kind of hybrid model, half online, half traditionally online, by поквартирный обход, by just people from Росстат knocking at other people's doors. And both parts were a failure. The knocking on doors parts was not a success because people wouldn't open these doors because of the pandemic and because they were not trusting state officials for self-evident reasons again. And the online part seems to have been largely invented by Росстат itself. This is not just some malicious gossip from dissatisfied demographers. A few months after the census was over, the deputy head of Росстат, who was responsible for this, was fired, which kind of tells us that the system itself was dissatisfied with the results. If we go to official sites and try to see what data is still available there, we'll see that, for example, Россельхознадзор, the agency for overseeing agricultural sector, has last been updated in 2014. Roskomnadzor, that watches over us all. Roskomnadzor is the service for informational surveillance, the one that is specifically concerned with foreign agents and online crime, last updated in 2019. Rosgvardia, in case you are curious, the National Guard site, last updated 2021. So much for transparency. You may perhaps have noticed that those of our colleagues, the social scientists, that are still in the country and that are trying to work in the country, are constrained to use this official data, whatever of it is still available. For example, Natalia Vasilievna Zubarevich, the most respected regional geographer and economist in the country, Professor Zubarevich, whenever she speaks publicly, as she heroically still does, always precedes her analysis with the phrase, "I'm using Росстат data." So all questions are to them. And this brings me to the third part of the problem. I have started with saying that we get this question, how can you know? How can you be an expert any longer if you can't even physically go to the country you are speaking about? But if a certain set of data becomes unavailable, it becomes equally unavailable to people like myself and to my colleagues in Russia. But I have the advantage of complaining to you about it, at least, which is a great consolation. And I have an advantage of being able to rationally discuss it with my peers. So we can come up with various ways to circumvent these obstacles and still continue our study in a rational and honest manner. My unfortunate colleagues in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in Yekaterinburg and Tomsk and Novosibirsk. They don't have that privilege. They have to pretend that things are still normal. They have to use just the official information, because using anything else can easily be criminalized. So, every scholar thinks their subject is unique. We Russians tend to think of our subject as the most unique in the world and also the most mysterious. Small thanks to Mr. Churchill for coining the phrase about Russia being this enigma wrapped in a mystery inside a whatever. All this is very flattering indeed, but Russia is no more mysterious, no more unknowable than any other authoritarian model. As an autocracy, it's pretty banal. The world is filled with personalist autocracies who do more or less the same thing: concentrate resources, monopolize power, try to control the public sphere, and distort data. Somebody said, I wish it were me because it's a good formula, that the dictatorships of the 20th century were 80% violence, 20% propaganda, and now it's the other way around. Of course, 20% violence becomes 100% if it falls on your own particular head, but still, propaganda and distortion of information and secrecy and concealment play a large role in maintaining authoritarian rule of today. So, our particular subject can be studied by means of scientific analysis. And here I come to the second part of my address, and this is the ways and means and instruments we can use to still continue our expertise in the situation we find ourselves in. So, you can't visit a country, and you cannot, and if you would take my advice, you should not be dependent on insider sources. Even in previous time, I myself was highly suspicious of them. I was more fortunate than many of my colleagues in my choice of a subject, because I study legislative process. So basically what I do is read a lot of bureaucratic documentation. I didn't need sources in the first place, although I was in the State Duma for most of my professional life in various capacities when I was working there and visiting it regularly when I became an academic and teacher. But still, I don't think that whatever your particular field of study is, you should put your trust in princes. You should put your trust in your friends on the other side. First, they can lie to you. Second, they can intentionally disinform you. But thirdly, and most importantly, they may not have a clue themselves. An insider, be he as high positioned as you can get, only sees their own particular angle of reality. They, more often than not, how do I put it mildly, they are not scholars. They're not intellectuals. They shouldn't be. We love them for different reasons. But they very often don't exactly understand what's going on. They prefer, when you ask them questions why this thing has happened, they usually give you a personalized answer. Because guy named X quarreled with guy named Y. That is all very well and useful, and it makes colorful headlines, but this is not scholarship, and this is not science. An ornithologist does not interview a gull. With all due respect for the opinions and experiences of a gull, they have a rather limited outlook on the general situation in the specific ecological niche they inhabit. It's more or less the same with your insiders. Again, if I were doing elite studies, then perhaps I would not be so dismissive of actual sources. But I have an advantage of being able to rely on actual documents. And this is my next step. So my own favorite site on all internet is the SOZD. Система обеспечения законотворческой деятельности. The system of maintaining legislative activity. Eloquent and pithy as Russian official language always is, it never disappoints. So, some examples of how we can use it. I am a bit superstitious talking about it because I'm always afraid that somebody else will hear and close down this system. But so far, surprising amount of information is available by using Duma's electronic database. Starting 1995, we have digitalized accounts of every Duma convocation, except the first one. The first one is not fully digitalized yet. But starting 1995, it's again surprisingly ample. We have voting results, transcripts of actual parliamentary sessions, and most importantly, we have all the bills, their texts, the related correspondence between various official bodies, all the transformations of the text from the introduction to the final third reading, their history, the dates, the initiators. So it's a mass of information. It is not being much used in Russian expertise. Why? Because the State Duma, for a reason, is not a respected governmental body. It is supposed to be not an independent or significant political actor, but just a rubber stamp. Michael has reminded you of the times back in 2015 when we were writing chapters in this book, The New Autocracy. So my chapter, written in co-authorship with my London colleague Ben Noble, was called Not Just a Rubber Stamp, and it was about a post-Soviet parliamentarism. So it's, again, it is considered a rubber stamp. I understand the reasons. I'm not pretending that it's a real parliament, but the second reason legislative processes is not attended to is because there's this idea that there is no rule of law in Russia, which is true, and for that reason, laws are not important because they are not implemented. The premise is correct, the conclusion is not. I said that Russian autocracy is pretty banal as far as personalist autocracies go. That is true. But if we have a specification, every autocracy must have something individual about it, although they are all as alike as happy families, according to Tolstoy. All autocracies are unhappy in similar ways, but they have some individuality. So if we do have something specific, it is the fact that Russian political system is a highly bureaucratized one. And bureaucracy runs on paper. It eats paper, it produces paper, it leaves a paper trail. So, the federal legislation is not a sign of a rule of law as it is understood in democratic countries, but it is a system of messages that the system sends to itself. Russia belongs to the so-called continental school of law as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon school. Continental school of law is based on codification rather than judicial precedent, like you do. That means that for the system, for the political machine, for the state in general to do something, it needs first to change a federal legislation, to introduce an amendment. That's why we have so many legislative changes going on at any period of time. That's why the State Duma is so busy. Sometimes things work the other way. The system does something and then it needs to legitimize it post factum. But either way, it leaves a paper trail and the papers are available. They are extremely hard to read because they are written in the language intended to befuddle your brain. It's a lingo of its own. For example, the most pernicious and therefore important legislative changes often come under the title «Проект федерального закона о внесении изменений и дополнений в некоторые законодательные акты Российской Федерации». You want me to translate it for you? It's a project of federal law of introducing certain amendments to certain federal acts of the Russian Federation. You are likely to miss it in this general flow of never-ending amendments, but if you have an experience in reading this, you will be warned that this is maybe something you should pay attention to. Also, we legislative process watchers, we know what specific sponsors or initiators of the bill deserve attention. We have our own specially marked, for example, State Duma deputies and Federation Council members that usually sponsor the bills that come from certain agencies and ministries. We know who lobbies for whom. Well, if you'd be doing it since 1999 like I was, you would gather some experience inevitably. It's not a huge conundrum. It just needs, again, experience. You know, this popular rule, how do you become an expert? 10,000 hours spent on anything make you an expert in anything. So it's just more or less a question of time. Also, certain State Duma committees are more equal than the others, especially in times when the state pays particular attention to particular subjects. And here comes my example. I will try to show how, by watching the legislative process, and this, again, publicly available and non-distortable information, you can distort it. It's the text that becomes the federal law. What you can do, for example, you can fail to publish tables of amendments. So you won't see how the text of the bill changed so drastically, proceeding from the first to the third reading. This is what they do, but you will still have the text of the third reading and the first reading. You can put them side by side. If you're adventurous, you can ask ChatGPT for help, but it will lie to you. It's a liar, a flatterer, and a liar. But using your natural intelligence, whatever heaven has endowed you with, you can still perceive the changes. So I will try to show how, by watching this, by reading these publicly available papers, we can understand how the Russian political system is feeling about its mobilization campaign that was conducted in 2022, and whether it is likely to repeat it anytime soon. So we have studied mobilization-related bills. Fortunately, these are almost all concentrated in the Committee of Defense, and they usually work together as a co-sponsor with the Committee of Social Affairs, because a lot of this has to do with, for example, social benefits for the mobilized or for the so-called participants of the special military operation. So, in terms of a number of bills, we see how a number of bills related to mobilization have increased after the mobilizing campaign itself has finished. Also, these mobilization-related bills have much higher adoption rates, about 80% higher adoption rates, and rapid legislative cycles. They approximately spent about 44 days in the State Duma, as compared to a much longer time needed for your average bill to pass from introduction to adoption. Also, these bills are sponsored by whom? You will see how, for example, the President of the Russian Federation has initiated some of this. But a surprising number of these mobilization bills came from regional legislative assemblies, which is a rather unusual sign, because usually, customarily, regional legislative assemblies have a very low level of adoption. But by the way, these are all the mobilization-related bills. Not all of them became actual federal laws, but you see by the amount of activity that perhaps that was a topic that was of interest to the regions. These are the successful initiators. So most of them came from senators, certain specific State Duma members and senators, and also from the government of the Russian Federation. Some details that can tell you what the system thought of the mobilizing campaign. Let me remind you that the so-called active phase of the partial mobilization lasted. Can someone recollect how long did it last? It started on the 21st of September 2022. How long did it last?
3 weeks.
Yes. I suspect you've been listening to me previously because, or you've been watching Russian internal politics really carefully. Yes. I also had an impression that it lasted like for months because it played havoc with the Russian society. It increased the levels of anxiety as measured by the Public Opinion Foundation up to 70%. An amount incomparable with anything that happened to Russia ever in recorded history. The start of the war itself was nothing in comparison. It also put such a strain on the system that I can say it almost collapsed, but it was in grave danger of snapping. And I will tell you in a moment how do we know that. But it only lasted for less than a month. It's not 3 weeks, it's 4 weeks. But on the 19th of October, the mayor of Moscow was the first to go on air and announce that the nightmare is over. And when the active phase was over, the legislation campaign started. What did it consist of? It consisted of a rather wide range of measures. What did the state started to do? First, it introduced a number of benefits for people who sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Not just payments. Payments are not in the federal legislation. Payments are divided in the federal part, which is set, the amount is set by the presidential decree, and the regional part, which is much larger, and that is the matter for the governors to decide and to find money for. So the legislative changes were about social benefits and privileges for the contractniki themselves and their families, like, for example, mortgage vacations, or the possibility for their children to get the so-called budgetary places in the universities so they can study for free, or housing tariffs exceptions, all sorts of things. Secondly, the barriers preventing a person from signing a contract were consistently lowered. There were previously certain, there were certain things you have to be in order to be able to sign a contract. You had to serve in the army for a certain period of time. You had to have higher education and the like. These were taken down, as I said, consistently until now. At the moment, you only need to be 18 years old. That is all. So, no obstacles at all. At the same time, the top age for being on the army contract was also raised. You are perhaps aware that this partial mobilization period is not over because there is no presidential decree that says it is over, and until it is not, it still goes on. That means that people signing the contract with the Ministry of Defense can't annul the contract on their own initiative, so it's practically timeless. And that also found its way in the federal legislation. But perhaps the most, I would say, disastrous amendment that was introduced was, of course, changes in Russian criminal legislation that allows a person, by signing a contract, not just to avoid punishment for crime, but to stop investigation of a crime. So if you sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense during investigation of the crime you are suspected of, you not just escape possible punishment even before a court decision is taken, but the crime itself disappears. This is pretty horrible. It takes down whatever of the legal framework existed in the Russian Federation. We are still a pretty criminal country, although our social tendencies of the last 15 years were all positive. Violent crime was on the decrease, in harmony with universal tendencies overall, the so-called great crime drop. Specifically, violent crime among the younger people was decreasing. Alcohol consumption was decreasing. Suicide rates, fatal road accidents, you name it. It was all on the decrease. Prison population was shrinking. It has shrunk since, even more tremendously, but for all the wrong reasons. Beware what you wish for. We were so actively campaigning for the decrease of Russian prison population, and it happened, but again, not the way we wanted it to. There's this English story called The Ape's Paw. You might have read it. It's a horror story. It's about an artifact that grants you your wishes, but in a way you wouldn't like to see. So this is more or less what happened in this particular sphere. But coming back to the legislative activity connected to mobilization, there was another detail that I promised to share with you. And it shows how the system itself assessed the mobilization that was partially over, that was partial and partially over. There was a new clause introduced into the Russian Code of Administrative Offenses that specifically targeted legal bodies and people occupying official positions for non-compliance with mobilization activities. What does it mean? It means that there was, if not downright sabotage, at least enough of official passivity that necessitated the introduction of a new criminal offense. So, taking all this, and yes, look at this slide. This, I think, is one of the most eloquent one. Here's the period from autumn of 2023 till autumn of 2024, when the maximum legislative activity connected with mobilization was going on in the Duma. This zero amount is, I think, just parliamentary vacations, but what does it tell us? It tells us several things. First, these 4 weeks of mobilization were considered, again, not by us, not by some pernicious foreign agents speaking from abroad, but by the system itself, as a dangerous experiment. There was a certain amount, a significant amount of, again, dangerous governmental or regional or municipal passivity. So perhaps officials on the ground were not too eager to send their neighbors and perhaps relatives to certain death. Third, the system, realizing this, set itself to invent an alternative toolbox of instruments that will allow it to replenish its stock of fighters without resorting to the dangerous instrument of mass mobilization. So it tells us that we can reasonably suppose that the system will avoid the repetition of 2022 as long as it can. We are not saying it will never happen. In political science, in social sciences generally, what is physically impossible cannot happen. All the rest can happen, which doesn't mean that it will. That is my conclusion number one. My conclusion number two, the system intends to continue fighting. It wants to keep replenishing its stock of meat, but without having to mobilize them. I think the danger they were afraid of was not mass protests per se. If it was that, we would have seen other changes in the federal criminal legislation, For example, making it even less possible to protest publicly. But we're seeing different types of changes. They were not, I assume, afraid of possible protests. They were afraid of non-compliance and administrative dysfunction. This most horrible situation for any power structure, when you give an order and nothing happens. This is truly the sign of an end. Autocracies can survive protest campaigns. We have seen them time and again surviving. The examples of Belarus, the example of Hong Kong, many examples show us that the famous 3.5% rule is not working. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept, there was a theory that if 3.5% of the population is directly or indirectly involved in protesting, then regime change follows. No. But administrative dysfunction is the end of any decision-making and decision-implementing system. This is more or less what happened in the late Soviet Union. The authorities, начальники, are saying something, but nothing follows. You just nod, but you don't do anything. This is the nightmare. Again, not mass protest. And all this, so these are the word clouds. They make pretty slides. So these are the most popular words in the titles. Yes, it has правонарушение, which is offenses, military service, territory, administrative, which means, of course, the code of administrative offenses. So we have more administrative than уголовный. We have more administrative than criminal, although we have quite a lot of criminal code amendments as well. But административных правонарушениях, both these words refer to the title of the Russian Code of Administrative Offenses. So, this is some more semantic analysis. Actually, speaking of the words, so for mobilization-related bill, of course, the most popular two words are военная служба, military service. For other bills, the most popular is the word is tax, and then again administrative, and again offenses. For the record, the most often changed pieces of legislation in Russia are the Code of Administrative Offenses and the tax code. Why? Because they affect everyday lives of the citizens. For example, law on government is very rarely amended, or on the president of the Russian Federation. So the authorities want stable legislation for themselves, but not for the people. My conclusion will be, the situation is not hopeless, even if we can't get access to the data that used to be available to us. We still have quite a lot of bureaucratic paperwork that we can read if we know how to read it. In addition to my beloved Duma's electronic database, we have other, sometimes unexpected sources. For example, Russian governmental bodies very often have their own publications, regular publications, like magazines. For example, there's this highly engaging production called the Military Commissariats of Russia. If you flip through these page turners, you can get the idea, for example, how the work on the electronic register of the mobilized is processing, and who is blaming whom for the fact that it is not processing in the way, at the rate it was planned. Or there is a magazine called Разведчик. What's the positive term for the spy? If you want to glorify a spy, what do you call him?
Intelligence officer.
Okay, intelligence officer, and that is published by SVR, by Служба внешней разведки, Foreign Intelligence Service, and it has become quite customary for officials like Naryshkin, who is head of this Foreign Intelligence Service, or Patrushev, to who is now advisor to the president, assistant to the president, that's slightly different position, more important one, to give interviews to this publication. Most of this is, of course, just public official rhetoric, but again, if you know how to read the language, you can get something out of it. If nothing else, it shows you what is the fashion of the season, what words you need to say at that particular moment to demonstrate your loyalty and effectiveness. And that is useful. Also, speaking of official speeches, there's such a regular event that is called Ministerial Collegium. It's the yearly convention of any ministry, and in case of the more important ministries like the FSB or the Ministry of the Interior, the president usually visits. And the ritual is the following. The minister says something, gives a speech. The purpose of the speech, especially if the president is present, is twofold. First, you need to brag of your successes. Second, you need to complain, because you need to ask for something. Otherwise, what's the use of having president on the spot? And from these complaints, you can see, for example, how large a percent of the personnel the Russian police is lacking. If you compare it to the percentage mentioned during the previous year's collegium, you can get your dynamics. President's speech is less worthy of attention, but доклады, the speeches of the ministers themselves are notable. No one pays much attention to this. First, it's boring as hell. Not that I personally find it boring, I love it, but I love bureaucracy. That's my subject, so I read these things so you don't have to. My point is not to glorify my own particular expertise, but to tell you that our subject, modern day Russia, is no more mystic and mysterious and unknowable and then whatever than any other subject under the earth. It can be studied, and it should be studied by rational means and instruments. And we should not be organizing undercover campaigns in order to listen to what the president is whispering in his sleep. You won't be able to do it. And if somebody tells you they will help you, they are deceiving you. But we still can use publicly available and verifiable information. The difficulty, not the difficulty, the task is to be able to analyze it in order to draw realistic conclusions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be ready to answer your questions, if any.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ekaterina. This was fascinating, really interesting. And I will use the privilege of being the moderator for asking the question I've been asking myself for a long time. So we've been speaking about social scientists to try to understand Russia. But what about the Russian government and those people that make these decisions in Russia? Like all the different sources of information that they had the data, but the data is no longer available or is manipulated. You rely on information from regional officials, from the FSB, from these intelligence agencies, but these people are lying to you. You are using surveys, but the surveys, the people don't respond anymore to these surveys. Before you had the press, you had an independent press, you had journalists who they're investigating these questions, but now all these journalists are in jail or abroad. You don't have them anymore. And then finally you had elections. And until 2022 or 2021, we had elections where you could actually learn something from these elections. No longer. So they're so manipulated that it's really increasingly doesn't make any sense to look at elections, to learn about dynamics in the different regions. So thinking about Russia, like a big ship, you have the Titanic, which is steering into the night. You have the captain on the bridge, and he needs information if there are icebergs or whatever. But how do you do this? And what do you think is going on? Do they just steer into the night, or do they have other sources of information?
That's a very good question. We've been asking it to ourselves a lot. I can describe the situation in this way. What you are saying has evidently been a suspicion or a knowing anxiety for the government itself. And by government, we understand most broadly the power system, the governmental system of Russia. This is why they have two specific fads that they are pursuing. First, their passion for registers. All sorts of information has to be put on a registry. Every governmental body, thank you very much. Yes, 1 cup of tea is not enough and then it gets cold. You see, bureaucracy runs on paper and lecturers, they run on tea and milk. So, every ministry has not one but various registers. I have mentioned this register of the mobilized. Strictly speaking, it's not of the mobilized, it's реестр военнообязанных, the register of all people that have military duty. And the initial idea was that all sorts of governmental bodies need to send their information to this specific registry so that the government will know everything about all the human resources that they have available. The Ministry of Agriculture had to send information about those males who are also tractoristi, who are doing active agricultural work. The Ministry of Sport has to send information about those of them who are engaged in sports or have won honors and degrees in that field. The Ministry of Healthcare had to send information about health, etc. The number of these registries is surprising. They are not available to the public. For example, this registry of people on military duty has to have a subdivision, which has recently been put online, partially, which is the registry of summons, of повесток. So you can go online, search yourself, and see whether you've been summoned for military duty or not. All sorts of consequences ensue if you don't show up during the 7 days after the appearance of this summons, but that's another subject. So they all have registries, but the example of this large and ambitious project of the registry of people on military duty, which is a priority, top priority for the government. It has been announced by presidential decree. Various deadlines have been set. Spoiler, none have been met so far. Why? For various reasons, but the most important of them is this. Ministries don't like sharing information. Their registries are their resource base, and they want it for themselves. A lot of it finds its way on a gray market. But a more important source of administrative income is that by using this information, they can do what Russian social scientists used to call selling of threats. When you invent a problem and you go to the top authorities and sell this problem and ask for budgetary resources to resolve it. That's the main thing that people on this administrative stock exchange engage in. So they have registries. They really have a lot of data. And the second passion that they have is the passion for surveys. During recent years, this activity has increased immensely. Every Russian alive is being surveyed, and I mean not by secret services, but by polling, both in person and by phone and online. Sometimes it's done by ВЦИОМ in a normal polling manner. Sometimes it's done on the working place or in the universities and colleges and schools, etc. The questions vary. It's interesting to watch how they change. I get sent these things a lot. People send me things for whatever reason. Oh, all sorts of things. And it's, you know, it's kind of heartbreaking because they know I can't help them. They know I can't influence Russian policies, but they want to put this letter in a bottle and throw it to the sea in the hope that at least human eyes will read it. So that is not an answer to your question, but I'm coming back to it in a moment. So the authorities do have enormous amounts of various data, but as you have very justly remarked, a lot of it is a lie. Whatever comes from, say, regional authorities who have incentive for distorting information can be doctored, to put it mildly. Whatever people say during surveys is just a demonstration of loyalty. My respected colleague Alexander Kinev, who still continues his heroic work in the country, once said in an interview that the government knows more about the country than the opposition does. I would put it a bit differently. The government has, of course, much more amount of the information, but two problems. They won't share it with each other, and second, I don't know if they're able to analyze it. I don't know what conclusions they draw, if any. They are quite clever at sometimes locating problems and trying to either get around them or sometimes even to resolve them. The example of mobilization is, I think, quite expressive of their ability. At the same time, if you remember, those of you that have been studying Soviet Union back then, there was this theory among the criminologists of the West that the Politburo, the top Soviet authorities, have a kind of black books available to themselves. So there's this official statistics that is for propaganda purposes, and there's the real data. And that the authorities know what is really happening with the Soviet народное хозяйство, people's economy. When Soviet Union collapsed and archives became available for a short period of time, it appeared that there were no black books. They were consuming the same data they were feeding the population. I don't know whether the case is different at the moment, but I have grave doubts as for their ability of the authorities to actually understand what this data tells them. And problem number three, even if you have drawn the right conclusion, for the approval of the more important decisions, you have to go to a person who is not given any information that can affect his spirits or darken his mood. So you go with one picture of reality to him if you are fortunate enough to gain an audience, and there you meet a person who lives in his own very special reality. So even if you have all the correct data and you have drawn all the right conclusions, what's the use? This is autocracy. This is the curse of authoritarian rule.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting and delightfully scientific talk, I would say. And it was very interesting how in the end, in your reply to the first question, you mentioned registries and databases. And I think that now the topic of like digitization and data gathering has surfaced its head in this green and pleasant land as well. There was a lot of talk about digital IDs. The UK currently does not have any central ID cards, and now there is talk of introducing them. But I guess we assume that the UK is a democracy, so the question would be, would you see that this kind of increased communication and data gathering is a slippery slope, which will mean that one sunny day, countries will get more power to do something to you, like send you a summon in Russia? Or would you say that there are some fundamental premises that will basically allow these data to be used for good only?
I'm not here to scare you with the technological dystopia. But yes, Britain is a democracy, bless its heart. On the other hand, for the number of surveillance cameras per square centimeter, London can compete with Moscow, this motherland of surveillance. It's a dangerous slope because, well, the question is not how much data is available to this or that governmental agency or to the government as a whole. The question is, what can they do to you using the information that they possess? And that's where democracy comes handy. In Russia, there are no obstacles of using whatever data the government possesses to hurt its citizens. And we don't just enjoy this borderline totalitarian pleasures, we also have a wild and unrestricted capitalism which allows the free sale of the data on the gray market. I don't know why we call it gray. It is not hiding anywhere. It's just in your face. So I'm not here to advise the happy citizens of the United Kingdom on how they should conduct their affairs, but guard whatever you have of your checks and balances system, and beware of the term effectivity when used in conjunction with state services or governmental rule or policy. Effectivity is a term that comes from business management. Government works according to different principles. It should not strive for speed and effectivity. Effectivity means maximum profit for minimum investment. The government guards peaceful and lawful activities of its citizens. It should not be achieving goals. I know that it sounds boring, you can't put it on an electoral slogan, but the healthy principle of any government is that one more day is over, thanks to God. That's it. People have goals. Companies have aims. Commercial structures have KPIs. Government should not take that much onto itself. It's dangerous because, philosophically speaking, it contradicts the principle formulated by Immanuel Kant. No person should be a mean, because everyone is a goal for themselves. So the government should not be using people to achieve goals. The government should be guarding people to do whatever they think they should do. So these instruments are just instruments that should be used for this one and only purpose. Fortunately, here on this blessed island, you prefer a smaller government. You don't like your governments to be too ambitious. Although we all know these days we want our politics to be spectacular. Germans used to love boring politicians. They were distrustful of rhetorics and, riveting shows for a reason. But the situation seems to be changing, and I don't like that. I also prefer my politics boring. As you know, I'm a fan of bureaucracy. So let us hope that the checks and balances and other instruments of a developed democracy will prevent these technological instruments from being used against the just freedoms and rights of the citizens.
Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent question, just like 2 seconds, because we're writing a book on this exact topic as well. Russia is not yet there yet, but if you look at China and some regions of China, and Xinjiang in particular, it's a proof of concept that it works, that you can have complete totalitarian surveillance in a region, and there's no politics, nothing possible anymore. So it's a real risk. It's a big risk for Russia, but also for our societies.
You mentioned earlier that the lack of functioning of the government and dysfunction is the main threat to autocracy rather than protest. So I was wondering whether it's possible to somehow demystify that dysfunction, because it seems like a very broad concept, and measure the level of dysfunction at certain points in time in the autocracy.
I'll try to elaborate this concept. So, in the most simple terms, dysfunction is what I have described it to be. You give an order, nothing happens. Things like, for example, technological failures or housing disorders or whatever, whenever there's no electricity in a large region of whatever city, or the transportation doesn't work. These accidents in themselves do not constitute administrative dysfunction. They happen, and people understand that they will be happening. But the question is, how do authorities react and whether this reaction has consequences? You can have numerous, for example, multi-apartment buildings freezing in winter. It happens. But you need to have a mayor and the governor and an investigative committee in place immediately. They will be taking measures, there will be TV news, criminal cases will be opened. Russian authorities think that any ill can be remedied by the application of a timely criminal case. This is official reaction. And in time, they do something to actually solve the problem. But if there is no official notice, or if there is official notice and then nothing happens. If, imagine, Moscow subway stops working for like 3 days, and then it starts operating again, and then breaks down in another couple of weeks. This is dysfunction. Or remittances in payments of pensions or salaries to governmental servants, and these become regular. This is the sign of dysfunction as well. Military disasters, if they are isolated accidents, and if they are followed by some sort of reaction that seems to have or is made to look like it has had consequences, that does not constitute administrative dysfunction. When officials start saying different things or bickering in public, this is read as a sign that things are not going well up there. Soviet and post-Soviet citizens have very sharp instincts that tell them when is the moment. So when the moment comes, you will know. But blowing up Crimean Bridge is not this kind of thing. The disruption of, let me put it this way, disruption of regularity, breaking up of a routine, this is dangerous. For example, I have mentioned this survey of anxiety levels ratings. You possibly are acquainted with this poll. It is published every Friday by the Public Opinion Foundation, Fond общественное мнение. We like it, we social scientists like it, because it's published every week. You can see long rows, so you can watch the dynamics, and the question itself is very cleverly formulated. It says, what is, in your opinion, the prevailing mood of the people around you? Not your mood, but that of the people. Because we are always as cool as cucumbers, but everybody else is just panicking out there. So, when, for example, in 2022 and partially in 2023, regular celebrations in New Year and May, during May festivities, were cancelled or annulled, that produced an increase in anxiety rates, perceived anxiety rates. Why? Is it threatening? No, not in itself, but it tells the people that something that used to be a custom and a routine is no longer possible. Therefore, ergo, situation is extraordinary. Something untoward is happening. This is the example of what would constitute perceptible administrative dysfunction. Last thing that I'll have to say, power is all about perception. It's like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. You can't violently repress every citizen of yours, and you cannot make your repressive mechanism work if people who constitute this mechanism no longer think you are in charge. So it's real, and at the same time it's illusionary. I'm afraid I sound like Varys from Game of Thrones. I don't want to be, for a number of reasons, but still, power is power as long as it is perceived to be such. And especially, specifically in autocracies, its citizens are judging their authorities by one and only criteria. whether they are strong or not. They are not asking whether they are effective, beneficial to themselves, humane, legal, whatever. They are asking this one question: are they strong enough or are they being weakened?
I was wondering about the checks and balances that we discussed a lot and how they're very important for the country to function as a democracy. And obviously many of them are broken in Russia. But I was wondering if there is still any that function. Because often when I discuss, I'm from Russia myself, and when I discuss the country, I think it is a very law-obeying, in very weird ways. It's a very law-obeying country. And there's many things that can happen post-factum, kind of. The law can be introduced post-factum. So I was wondering what's your opinion, which things still function by the law, or whether there's still any checks and balances at all, or whether anything can happen and then post-factum be
These are two separate questions. What serves as checks and balances? And any power system needs checks and balances. Even autocracies that by definition are systems based on monopolization of power. And second part of your question is whether the laws work. Let me start with the second. They do, but in a peculiar way. They move in mysterious ways. As I mentioned, Russian legislation is the system of signals that the system sends to itself. So it's bureaucracy talking to itself. Authorities are telling other lower level authorities how they should conduct their affairs. In this sense, the law is being implemented. The greatest mistake in my field that I hear repeatedly is it does not matter what is in the law. No one abides by the law. It is so wrong. Previously, there was this formula. The laws are good, but they are not implemented. They are horrible, and they are implemented. They are written specifically in such a way as to allow maximum freedom to the implementing bodies. They are vague by intention. They are what lawyers called a blanket disposition by intention. This is what the parliament does. It takes all the blame for forbidding something to itself while delegating real power to lower and lower level executive power bodies. So, the laws are very much worth paying attention to, but again, not as instruments of legality, but as instructions. This is why we have to watch not just federal legislation, which is my specific field, but also the so-called normative documentation, the instructions that ministries and other governmental bodies write for themselves. These are often more important than the constitution. So the pyramid of law is reversed in case of Russia. The lower the level, the more rigorously this norm will be implemented, while constitutional provisions are more or less rhetoric. And your question about checks and balances, it's a curious one. If you are an autocrat in a personalist autocracy, you try to amass as much power as you can. But you cannot rule a country by yourself, nor with the help of your 5 friends. You have to disseminate authority. And you also have to avoid the emergence of other competing power actors, not just opposition. But, for example, if you are a repressive autocracy, you need a repressive apparatus. If you are fortunate enough to to evolve into what we call a solidified autocracy, then you have a strong and unified repressive apparatus. Question: how do you prevent that repressive apparatus from biting your own head off? Comrade Stalin had a recipe for this. What he did was killing off layer after layer of his political police, so that it doesn't have time to sort of grow roots and become strong enough to evolve into some sort of Praetorian Guard that can change the power. His other instrument that he used to a less extent, but his successors used it a lot, was breaking down of governmental bodies. Don't create a monster. Don't create a unified ministry of state security. You know who did this? Beria did this. In the few eventful months that passed from Stalin's death till his own, what he did was to pass through Politburo a decision to unite NKVD with the MVD into this monstrous body called the Ministry of State Security. And the first thing his loving communist comrades did after they shot him was to divide it and to create the Committee of State Security, the KGB, rather than a ministry. You understand the difference? They lowered the level of this particular governmental body and subjected it to themselves. They didn't want another NKVD or OGPU to emerge in their lifetime or later. Later, unfortunately, the KGB got rid of the party authorities and took the whole of power to itself. But what I'm driving to is this. Our autocracy, while being repressive, is still not totalitarian. It still keeps to this post-Stalin agreement, according to which elite members avoid killing each other. Some people do fall out of windows. That happens, you know, accidents happen in the best regulated families, but there is no capital punishment, so there are no official murders. So the division of governmental bodies is still a thing, although the FSB is dangerously close to the Ministry of State Security. But the FSB is not a united body within itself. It's a curious construction. It's rather a collegium of departments. Its services, службы, are feudal territories by themselves. Their heads are mighty lords. The director of the FSB, both by the virtue of this composition and because of his age and health, is rather, you know, the presiding person over this round table of knights, rather than a minister in the sense that Kolokoltsev is a minister of the interior. So heads of services, the dread second service that watches over us all, or the fifth, or those that do economic crime surveillance, they have their own resource base, their own field, their own ways of getting immensely rich. They do not really answer to the director of the FSB. This, I think, is the way our current authority prevents the emergence of a primus inter pares, which the head of FSB can become. It will be a curious moment in the evolution of the Russian political system when Bortnikov steps down. If somebody of his high and mighty deputies becomes the new director and tries to unify the FSB into a real solidified governmental body, this will be a change. In the same vein, see the effort that is being taken by political leadership to prevent the army from becoming a political actor. I can talk a lot about it because it's extremely curious, but just a few words. It would have seemed natural for a country at war to have popular generals and a strong minister of defense. Nothing of this kind seems to be happening. Our power system still preserves the Stalinist policy of preventing the army from achieving political subjectivity. Sorry for the awkward phrase. So secret services, siloviki bodies are political actors, but the army and the navy are not. This is what replaces checks and balances in the absence of public political competition and electoral turnover. This is, as O. Henry put it in one of his stories, sand is bad replacement for oats, but it shows us that even an autocracy that some have called a dictatorship still needs some surrogate for the division of powers.
Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. And on the note of kind of data manipulation or misrepresentation, in the Soviet Union, if you were a physicist or an engineer, then conducting science with kind of the desired scientific integrity and rigor was quite difficult because you always had the administrative pressure to build the biggest gun or the biggest spaceship. In modern Russia, are you aware if there is any administrative pressure on academia outside of the social sciences to somehow misrepresent their scientific findings? And why would the government want this? Or does the government not care about STEM at all right now?
I'm not aware of direct administrative pressure to show some impressive results and build a Tsar rocket. But what I'm aware, which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, it's just me not knowing. But what I'm very much aware of, and what everyone is aware of, is the way scientists, including in this field, are subjected to the FSB control. And how are they regularly, routinely accused of treason? The hypersound branch of physics has been virtually exterminated by a number of criminal cases resulting in lengthy prison terms. You can be called a spy not just by communicating with the so-called unfriendly countries, but by speaking at a conference in China. By the way, Chinese spies are so popular this season. So many of them on on the best platforms in Moscow courts. So it doesn't help if you are working with a friendly country. Friendship without borders, what is it? Brotherhood with benefits or whatever, is no guarantee at all. As we speak, I think the Federal Council has already approved new amendments to the federal legislation that demands preemptive sanction from the FSB for any scientific activity or event or study involving foreigners. Actually, this specific legislation is, I think, a rather pitiful, call it pathetic, a heartbreaking attempt, not of the FSB, but of the Ministry of Science to safeguard the scientists by making FSB approve whatever they are going to do before they do it. They think they will, in this way, get some paper that they will protect themselves with. I call it pathetic and heartbreaking because, spoiler alert, it will not help. The FSB will not be constrained by any paper, even of their own making. They will say that we have approved one line of research or one scenario of a conference, and what you have done was actually state treason and espionage. So, God save whomever is trying to do science in Russia these days.
Thank you very much for this fascinating meeting. I'm not sure that
It's working, but slightly very.
Yeah, if you speak louder, it will help.
So, Ekaterina, I know that you like reading books. And
that's what I do for a living, reading, writing, and speaking. That's how I earn my bread.
And so you might be aware that Oxford Dons and Cambridge Dons are currently discussing a recently published book about marriage between a prominent British art historian and a curator of Hermitage Museum, Princess Haskell and Larissa Haskell.
I have heard the name today when visiting the Ashleyan Museum.
Yeah, so that the Ashleyan Museum. Yeah, so this is a book by written by Ian Pierce. My question is, so this story of love, that's what you read in the book, but it also a question of how people lived, how people kind of meet each other in the time of this Iron Curtain. And so I'm so worried that I forgot what I wanted to ask.
So you wanted to draw my attention to the book, and
because so this was a time of, I mean, as these two people presented in the book, that they actually were great contributors to the soft power between the two countries. So in the new era, just in case if we have this Russian regime developing for another decade. So,
which is not impossible.
so what do you think about soft power nowadays in the new era of internet and so on?
I also noticed that you can't get married in Oxford without having a book written about it, which is good. If I were not married already, I would possibly avail myself of this possibility. Soft power. Well, I'm coming from London, where the day before yesterday, I was present at the Pushkin House Book Prize ceremony. This is an annual prize for the best non-fiction book in English on a Russian subject, on a subject connected with Russia. Pushkin House is exactly such an institution established in the 60s of the last century that aims to disseminate knowledge of Russian culture in the English-speaking world. And I think it's brave, almost heroic of them to continue carrying on their work after 2022, when the word Russian is not so popular for whatever reason, and you can't possibly put it on a announcement, on a public announcement, without incurring danger from both sides. You can have Russians trying to interfere with you, and you can have Ukrainians trying to interfere with you. So you are beset with dangers on all sides, but still they continue doing this. This demonstrates that, yes, I don't really know what soft power means, although I used to explain this term in one of my status programs, where I explain political science, social science terminology. But what I can perceive that these days, in the post-2022 situation, the Russian government can no longer use these instruments. Let them be satisfied with bombing their neighbors into loving them. They no longer have the soft power resource. It's somewhat a pity that Russian culture, in the broadest sense, from literature to food, is so attractive to foreigners. I've known people, marvelous people of high culture, falling in love with it, and they can't disengage themselves from this allure, no matter what Russia does. We have enough to impress humanity. If our authorities were a little less crazy, with the help of, I don't know, Chekhov and then Buckwheat, we could conquer the hearts of the every nation on earth, but we have not been using it much, even in peaceful times, although we had our moments, but now that is out of the question till the time of regime change in the country. But independent institutions, cultural organizations, brave and loyal Russian experts can still carry on this work, and they can demonstrate that Russia as a country is not synonymous with the administration of the day. We were there before them, we will be there after them. We are the civilization, the Cyrillic civilization on this territory in the northern Eurasia. So we will be there while there is still alphabet and people able to use it. We will survive the current sorry state of affairs.
Thank you very much.
So, that was evidently the fitting conclusion to this evening's discussion. Thank you ever so much for your attention to what really was a very, very specific subject. I was not aware that it's of much interest to anyone but myself. So I'm very glad to have had an audience today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before we conclude, I would like to thank you once again for being here tonight. I would also like to announce our next event, and actually it's the last event of the academic year. As some of you know, we are displaying an exhibition at Wolfson College right now. It's works by a great Russian artist, Pavel Adelnov, who's a renowned chronicler of the post-Soviet space. The exhibition is called Sins from a Nightmare. Incidentally, Pavel is Ekaterina's favorite, as some of you will know. She uses his famous Swan Lake piece in intros to her YouTube show.
I also have a T-shirt with this picture.
And guess what? We're actually displaying this piece at Wolfson right now. So.
And can one get T-shirts?
Yes, actually, I'll come to that. On the 27th of June at 6:30 p.m., we'll be throwing a little nice soiree to close the exhibition. The artist will be in present, so you'll be able to interact with him. And yes, we will be giving out T-shirts with Swan Lake signed by Pavel. Another thing is, if you would like to support our activities, you can find out how to do so on our website and social media, either by volunteering. We have a couple of vacancies on our committee right now. If this is of interest, please approach me and I will be able to give you more information. Your support is the only thing that helps us keep this conversation going. And yes, I guess that's it from me. Thank you all very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Маечка с хорошо известными публике танцующими космонавтами. Работа художника Павла Отдельного сейчас будет подписана и может быть получена тем, кто выиграет аукцион. Каковы будут требования этого аукциона, сообщат вам позже. Мы делаем это, историческое дело, в райском саду внутреннего дворика Тринити колледжа. Тут идиллично, я бы сказала. Облачно и тепло. И эти исторические интерьеры как бы наводят нам на мысль, нас, о том, что учение – свет, а не учение – тьма. Руководствуясь этим принципом, сейчас будем подписывать. Надеюсь, что нас не сдует ветром. Автор этой исторической картины, художник Павел Отдельнов, подпишет майку тоже. Это вот я сейчас просто начинаю эту работу, а завершит ее автор вот этой вот замечательной композиции. На заднем плане в нашем воображении звучит музыка, которая обычно сопровождает вот этих вот лебедей.
Мы находимся в Wolfson колледже в Оксфорде. Сегодня первый день после закрытия моей выставки Sins from a Nightmare, которая прошла здесь, в этих стенах. И сейчас я подпишу легендарную футболку.